welcome back to the Velvet Underworld channels. And after this video, I would really like to know your thoughts about these stories. Feel free to share it under the comment sections and where you come from so that we could connect to each other better through this channel. Thank you.
The driver working for you has just destroyed 5 years of my mother's devotion. That envelope of cash in your man's hand, is that really how you intend to settle everything? The 7-year-old boy stood in the middle of the wreckage, lifting his chin as he looked straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city, without the slightest trace of fear. It was early morning in the Harrington neighborhood, just as Magnolia Bakery had opened its doors to a new day, while the scent of vanilla and cinnamon still drifted softly through the glass entrance. A convoy of black Maybachs sped down the street, and the lead car suddenly swerved to avoid a truck backing up, lost control in a split second, and drove straight into the front of the bakery. Glass exploded in every direction. Display shelves collapsed, and flour and sugar burst into the air, whitening the whole room like a small storm sweeping through without warning. From the second Maybach, Reed Ashford stepped out. He was tall in a black three-piece suit, his sharply cut face untouched by expression, his eyes moving over the destruction, as though he were assessing a failed contract, rather than an entire shop that had just been crushed to pieces. Cross, Reed's right-hand man, quickly signaled for his men to put up a barrier. One of them stepped forward with a thick envelope of cash, ready to solve the problem the way they always handled any obstacle that appeared in their employer's path. Amara Price came out from behind the counter, her brown hair neatly tied back, flour still clinging to her apron, and stood there staring at 5 years of her labor shattered before her eyes. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, her hands gripping the edge of her apron, struggling to stay calm even as her world had just collapsed in front of her. Then Phoenix appeared. The 7-year-old boy came through the back door, still holding the book he had been reading, glanced around once, and then walked straight toward the men in black suits. He passed through the line of guards, as if they were nothing more than invisible lampposts, and no one managed to stop him before he came to a halt right in front of Reed Ashford. Cross moved to pull the boy away, but Reed raised a hand to stop him, his gaze fixed on this strange little child. "So what do you think should be done?" Reed asked, not out of concern, but out of curiosity about the child who dared to look directly into his eyes without fear. Phoenix pointed toward the bakery, his voice calm, as if he were answering a question in a classroom. "You fix it. You fix it for real, not by throwing money at us as if we're just a problem that needs to disappear. You ruined it, so you have to make it right." A strange silence fell over everything. Reed's men exchanged glances, while Cross stood motionless like a statue. Reed studied the boy in front of him, the tousled brown hair, the sharp gray-blue eyes, the small frame standing straight without hesitation, and on the boy's wrist was an old watch that had stopped running long ago. Then Reed's gaze shifted to Amara, the woman standing behind her son with her hand resting on his shoulder. For one brief moment, their eyes met, and something passed through Reed's eyes too quickly, too fleetingly, for anyone to understand. "Handle this for me. Handle it properly," Reed said to Cross, then turned and stepped back into the car. Phoenix stood watching the convoy drive away. He said nothing more. He simply turned a page in the book in his hands, even though his eyes were no longer reading the words. The 7-year-old boy did not know that the man who had just destroyed his mother's bakery was his biological father, and that man did not know that the child who had looked into his eyes without trembling carried half of his blood. If you want to know what happens next when this father and son discover the truth, please press like and share this video right away. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next episodes of this deeply emotional story. That evening, the small apartment above the ruined bakery lay under a silence so heavy it felt almost suffocating. Amara sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by uneven stacks of insurance papers scattered in weary disorder. A pen rested in her hand, yet she wrote nothing. She only stared at the numbers as though they belonged to some foreign language she could no longer understand. The yellow light spilled over her exhausted face, casting shadows that deepened the lines of worry across her forehead, lines that had never been there before. From the corner of the living room, Phoenix watched his mother. He sat curled into an old armchair upholstered in faded floral fabric, his small feet unable to reach the floor, the book he had been reading lying face down across his lap, though his mind was no longer inside its pages. He had a small leather notebook with corners worn soft by time, a place where he wrote down everything important he saw and heard. It was a habit he had learned from his grandfather before the old man passed away. His grandfather had once sat beside him beneath the oak tree in the backyard and told him to write down everything he noticed, because one day those notes would become the clues that led him to the answers. Quietly, Phoenix opened the notebook. The pencil in his hand moved in lines of handwriting unusually neat for a child of 7, and he wrote that the man with the steel-gray eyes had not apologized at all, even though his driver had destroyed the bakery. But what mattered was that the man had stopped his subordinates when they tried to pull him away, that he had listened to him speak, and that he had ordered everything to be handled properly. He paused, then looked down at his wrist where the old watch rested in stillness, like a loyal friend who had fallen asleep long ago. The hands were frozen at 3:47, unmoving for the past 3 years, ever since the day his grandfather closed his eyes for the last time. His grandfather had given him that watch exactly 1 week before he died. Phoenix still remembered with perfect clarity the way the old man had taken his hand, placed the watch into his small palm, and told him that this watch was very special, that it would start ticking again when Phoenix found the place where he truly belonged. He had waited for 3 years. He had worn the watch every day without fail, yet it remained silent, still trapped in the moment of 3:47. The scrape of a chair across the floor pulled him from his thoughts. Amara had risen and was walking toward him now, her eyes red-rimmed, though she tried to hide it behind a strained and fragile smile. She told him to go to bed because it was very late, that everything would be all right tomorrow, that she would find a way to solve it. Phoenix closed the notebook, but he didn't stand up at once. He lifted his face to look at his mother and asked whether the man from today, the one with the black convoy and the men in suits, was someone she knew. Amara faltered in mid-step. It lasted only a brief moment, but it was long enough for Phoenix to know that something wasn't right. She asked why he would say that, her voice trying to remain calm, yet carrying the faintest tremor that this sharp-eyed 7-year-old boy didn't miss. He answered that the man had looked at her, not at the shattered bakery, not at the broken glass or the flower spinning through the air, but straight at her, as though he had been searching for something in her eyes. Amara let out a short laugh, a laugh that never reached her eyes. Then she reached down to smooth her son's hair and told him that he imagined too much, that he read too many books and let his thoughts wander, and that he should go to sleep before he couldn't wake up in the morning. Phoenix didn't argue. He rose, hugged his mother goodnight, and went to his room. But before he crossed through the doorway, he turned back to look at her one more time and saw that she had already turned away, her shoulders trembling ever so slightly. Once he was lying in bed in the small room that had space for nothing more than a single bed and a study desk. Phoenix opened the notebook again, beneath the pale yellow glow of his night lamp. He added to the page that his mother had not told the truth, that her hands had trembled when he asked about the man, and that she had avoided looking him in the eye when she answered. He set the pencil down and looked at the watch on his wrist in the darkness, the glass faintly catching the reflection of the lamp. He wondered why he had not been afraid of that man at all. He had seen that everyone around him was afraid. Even the large men in black suits lowered their heads when he spoke. Even the people in the neighborhood stepped aside when the convoy passed. But he hadn't. Maybe, he whispered to the watch as though speaking to an old friend, it was because he was braver than his small body appeared. Or maybe it was because he still didn't know what he was supposed to fear. Or perhaps it was because there had been something familiar in that man's eyes, something he couldn't name. From the living room came the sound of his mother sighing, a long and weary sigh carrying all the weight of exhaustion and worry. And after that came the rustle of papers being gathered, the click of the light turning off, and the soft footsteps moving toward her room. Phoenix lay still in the darkness, listening to every smallest sound in the apartment, storing all of it carefully in his mind. He didn't know that tonight would be the last night his life remained ordinary. He didn't know that the man with the steel eyes would change everything. He didn't know that the watch on his wrist would soon find its reason to run again. At that same moment, about 20 minutes by car from the Harrington neighborhood, Reed Ashford's office on the top floor of Ashford Tower lay in darkness, broken only by the glow of the city streaming through the enormous floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was vast, yet so stripped down that it felt cold, almost severe. There was only a desk of black oak set at the center, a few charcoal leather chairs, and bookshelves lined with perfect order along the single wall that wasn't made of glass. Reed stood by the window with his back to the door, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he never once lifted to his lips. while the city lights flickered below like a sea of fallen stars spread across the earth, weaving tangled ribbons of light through the streets. He had been standing there for nearly an hour since returning from the Harrington neighborhood, his mind circling back again and again to the moment that 7-year-old boy had stepped through the barrier of his men and looked straight into his eyes, without even blinking. A knock sounded at the door. Cross entered after being given permission, moving with the steady confidence of a man who had followed Reed for the past decade and knew every habit his employer possessed. Cross reported that everything had been arranged. The best repair crew would begin restoring the bakery first thing the next morning. Every cost would be paid through the insurance company they controlled, leaving behind no trace that could ever be led back to Ashford. Reed didn't turn around. He remained where he was, still looking out over the city, his voice low, and even as he said that he wanted Cross to find out about the woman who owned that bakery. Cross paused for the briefest beat. In 10 years of working for Reed, he had rarely seen his boss take an interest in anyone this way, especially not an ordinary woman who owned a small bakery in a working-class neighborhood. He asked whether the investigation should include her family as well. Reed turned then, his eyes revealing nothing at all, as he replied that yes, he wanted to know who she lived with when the bakery had opened, whether she was involved with anyone, whether anyone visited her regularly, everything Cross could possibly find. Cross nodded and accepted the order, but he didn't leave right away. He stood there for a moment, as though weighing whether he should ask more, and at last he spoke, saying that he wanted to know why his boss was interested in a woman who had no connection whatsoever to either their business world or their underworld. Reed was silent for a long while. His finger tapped lightly against the rim of the whiskey glass, creating a quiet, measured clicking in the stillness of the room, and then he said that the child from today had not been afraid of him. In the past 10 years, no one had ever stood before him without at least a trace of caution or fear in their eyes. Not even the enemies who faced him across negotiating tables. Not even the coldest criminals lowered their gaze only after a struggle when he entered the room. But that 7-year-old boy had looked straight at him, as though he were nothing more than an ordinary customer stopping by his mother's bakery. Cross considered this for a moment, then answered that perhaps the boy was simply too young to understand the situation. Too young to realize who his boss was and how dangerous those men in black suits truly were. Reed slowly shook his head, set the whiskey glass down on the desk, and said that it wasn't that. That child understood everything clearly. He had looked at Reed's men, at the convoy, at the way people in the neighborhood reacted when Reed appeared. He had taken it all in, and still chosen to step through the barrier and face him. That wasn't the innocence of a child. That was a calmness, with intention behind it. Reed turned back toward the glass, his gaze distant, as though he were looking at something invisible beyond the farthest edge of the skyline. He went on to say that either that child carried something unusual inside him, or there was some deeper reason he wasn't afraid of Reed. And whatever it was, Reed intended to know. Cross understood that this was the final word. He nodded, turned, and left the office, the door closing softly behind him and leaving Reed alone in the hush of the room. Once he was by himself, Reed crossed to the desk, lowered himself into the leather chair, and opened the drawer on the left. Inside lay a black silk handkerchief, folded with great care. It was old now, its color faintly worn by time, yet it had still been kept as though it were something precious. In one corner were 2 small initials embroidered in silver thread, now faded nearly beyond recognition. A.M. Reed looked at the handkerchief for a long time. This had been his habit for 8 years. Whenever something happened that kept sleep from coming, he would open this drawer and look at the handkerchief as though it might offer him some answer to the questions that stirred inside him. He had never admitted the existence of this handkerchief to anyone. No one knew that the powerful master of the Ashford Empire kept such a small keepsake from a night he had tried to forget for nearly a decade. At last, he put the handkerchief away, closed the drawer, and turned his face back toward the glass. Outside, the city still burned with light as though it had never once slept, but inside Reed's mind, the image of the boy's gray-blue eyes kept returning. Those eyes looked like someone he had once known, looked so much like that person that it had made him stop and order his men to investigate, instead of simply getting back into the car and leaving as he always did. Looked so much like that person that it had driven him to open the drawer and take out the handkerchief tonight. Looked so much like that person that he had begun to wonder whether the night 8 years ago had left behind something he had never known existed. 1 week had passed since the day the Maybach crashed into Magnolia Bakery, And what surprised Amara most wasn't that the shop had been repaired, but the astonishing speed at which everything had happened. In the space of just 7 days, the front of the bakery had not only been restored to its original state, but had been completely upgraded, with brand new tempered glass display shelves, a modern industrial refrigerator, replacing the old one that was always breaking down, and even the oven Amara had used for 5 years had been replaced by the newest model, the kind she had only ever dared to admire in a catalog. Amara didn't ask who had paid for all of it. She didn't want to know, because she understood that the answer would lead to other questions she wasn't yet ready to face, questions about the man with the steel-gray eyes and the black silk handkerchief she had kept hidden for 8 years. One weekend afternoon, while Amara was busy delivering a large order to a longtime customer in the outskirts of the city, Phoenix was left at home with Martha, the 67-year-old neighbor who lived in the apartment right next door. Martha was a kind-hearted woman with snow-white hair and eyes that always narrowed when she smiled. She often helped Amara watch Phoenix whenever she had to make deliveries far away or work late. That afternoon, she sat on the old sofa watching her favorite television program, and little by little she drifted into sleep, her soft snoring rising and falling steadily through the small living room. Phoenix sat in the corner pretending to read, but in truth he had been waiting for this chance. He wanted to search for something that might give him an answer about that mysterious man and the connection between him and his mother. He remembered that his mother had once said his grandmother had left behind a box of family baking recipes on the high shelf in the kitchen, and Phoenix decided this was the right moment to find out more. He slipped quietly from his chair, his footsteps making no sound on the old wooden floor, pulled a chair over to the shelf, and climbed up to reach the tin box faded by time. Inside were yellowed sheets of paper covered in his grandmother's graceful handwriting, each one filled with baking recipes. Phoenix turned through them carefully, and then something fell from between the pages. A black silk handkerchief, soft and smooth, landing neatly in the palm of his hand. This handkerchief was completely unlike anything else in their small apartment. The fabric was so fine it felt like water, and in one corner an intricate embroidery formed 2 interwoven initials in silver thread, slightly faded by the passing years. R.A. Phoenix lifted the handkerchief closer to his face. A very faint scent still lingered on it even after so many years. Sandalwood mingled with something warm that he couldn't quite name, and yet it felt strangely familiar. He remembered that morning at the bakery, when he had stood in front of the man with the eyes and the black Maybach convoy. There had been a faint fragrance coming from him, exactly the same as the scent clinging to this handkerchief. R.A. Reed Ashford. Those 2 letters began to turn again and again in Phoenix's mind, like pieces of a puzzle slowly slipping into place. He didn't put the handkerchief back right away. Instead, he took out the old phone his mother had given him for emergencies and snapped a picture of the handkerchief with the embroidered initials in the corner, then carefully returned it to exactly where it had been, placing the recipe pages over it as though no one had touched a thing. That night in his room, Phoenix opened his worn leather notebook and wrote in neat, careful lines that R.A. could be Reed Ashford, that his mother had kept the man's handkerchief in his grandmother's keepsake box, which meant she had kept it for a very long time, perhaps from before he was even born, and the question was why and what the relationship between them had been. In the days that followed, Phoenix took every chance he could get to visit the public library 3 blocks from home. He sat in front of a computer and typed Reed Ashford's name into the search bar, and dozens of results opened before him like a doorway into the world of that mysterious man. Successful businessman, billionaire, owner of Ashford Syndicate, the empire controlling most of the city's port and logistics operations. Some articles called him the Dark King of Ashford City, a man whose power stretched farther than outsiders could ever truly see. Phoenix found many photographs of Reed at charity events and business conferences. He always appeared alone, with no wife, no children, no family mentioned beside him. The articles speculated about his secretive private life, but no one seemed to know anything for certain. One old article from 15 years earlier caught Phoenix's attention, with a headline about Reed Ashford's journey from the son of a butler to the master of an empire. Phoenix read every line carefully. The article said that Reed had grown up in the mansion of the Montgomery family, part of the city's old upper class. His father had been the loyal butler who had served that family for decades. After the Montgomery family went bankrupt because of failed business dealings and his father died of illness, Reed had built his future with his own hands until he became the most powerful man in the city. Phoenix stopped and thought for a long moment. Reed's father had been a butler in a great mansion. His mother had once told him that his grandmother had been a cook in a mansion too, and that his mother had grown up there throughout her childhood. Could it have been the same place? He wrote down his deductions in the notebook, that R.A.'s father had been a butler, while his grandmother had been a cook in a mansion, that his mother and R.A. might have known each other since childhood, and that he needed more confirmation. That night, while mother and son were sitting together at dinner, Phoenix asked casually for his mother to tell him about when she was young, where she had lived before she had this bakery. Amara paused for 1 second, her eyes drifting far away for the briefest moment. Then she answered that she had lived in a very large house, and that because his grandmother had been the cook there, she had been allowed to live there too. Phoenix asked how large the house had been. Amara smiled faintly, as though remembering a distant time, and said that it had been very large, almost like a small castle, with enormous gardens, a swimming pool, and even a tennis court. Back then, she used to run and play all over those gardens. Phoenix went on and asked whether she had anyone to play with there, and this time Amara was silent longer than usual. Her eyes fell to her bowl of rice before she answered that yes, there had been someone, only one person. He asked where that person was now. Amara rose from the table, carried the dishes to the sink, and answered over her shoulder that life carries people in different directions, my son, and not everyone can stay beside each other forever. Phoenix asked nothing more. He understood that this was the boundary his mother didn't want to cross, but in his notebook that night, he added that his mother had once had only one friend at the mansion and didn't want to speak about that person, that her reaction suggested it was either a painful memory or something she wanted to keep hidden, and that it was highly possible that friend had been R.A., and more evidence was needed. In the weeks that followed Phoenix's discovery of the mysterious handkerchief, Magnolia Bakery began receiving unusual visitors, the kind Amara never once suspected had a hidden origin. Reed Ashford didn't appear in person. Instead, well-dressed men in formal suits stopped by every day to buy large quantities of pastries, each with a different reason prepared in advance. One day they said they needed croissants for a morning office meeting. Another day they ordered a birthday cake for an employee. Some weeks they called ahead to place large catering orders for company events, forcing Amara to wake at 3 o'clock in the morning to begin preparing everything. Amara was astonished by the sudden surge in business, as though some benevolent star had finally cast its light over her little bakery. She worked harder than ever, hired a young woman named Jenny to help with sales in the mornings, and for the first time in the entire 5 years she had struggled to keep the bakery alive. Her savings account held a number large enough to let her dream of sending Phoenix to extra language classes. But Phoenix was different. The 7-year-old boy with the sharp, watchful eyes missed nothing that happened around him. He noticed the small logo embroidered on the breast pockets of the suits worn by the men who came to buy pastries, a stylized letter A formed with sharp, elegant lines, the symbol of Ashford Corp. That he had seen in newspaper articles while researching Reed Ashford at the library. He noticed the glossy black Maybachs that occasionally slowed as they passed the bakery, as if the people inside were observing something, before accelerating again and disappearing into the traffic of the street. He noticed all of it, and recorded every detail carefully in his leather notebook, with handwriting neat and controlled, and a precision far beyond his years. One afternoon, the bakery door opened, and Phoenix looked up from the book in his hands. He recognized the man who had just entered at once, even though he was wearing an ordinary shirt instead of the black suit he had worn on the day of the accident. It was Cross, the man who had stood right beside Reed Ashford that day, the one who had tried to pull him away when he stepped past the line of guards to face their employer. Cross approached the counter with the composed expression of an ordinary customer and told Amara that he wanted to place a large order for a company event the following week, around 200 pastries of different kinds, and that he would pay the full amount in advance along with a generous tip. Amara served him with the same professional warmth and friendly smile she offered every customer. She didn't recognize who he was or understand his connection to the accident the week before. But Phoenix remembered that face with perfect clarity, those sharp eyes, the way he carried himself, and he knew this wasn't a random coincidence. He said nothing. He simply kept pretending to read while his ears caught every word exchanged between his mother and the man, while his eyes occasionally lifted to observe the smallest movement. That night, in his room, Phoenix made a new page in his notebook with the title, Things Ashford Corp. Has Done for the Bakery. He listed everything one item at a time in careful handwriting, the complete repair of the bakery after the accident, The upgraded equipment, including the display shelves and refrigerator and oven, the large weekly orders from men wearing uniforms with the Ashford Corp logo, the repair of the air conditioner when it broke the week before his mother had even called a technician, the replacement of the leaking pipe in the back room when no one knew where the repairman had come from. The list kept growing, and the longer Phoenix looked at it, the clearer one truth became. All of it had been done quietly. No one stepped forward to claim credit. No one asked for thanks. No one left any direct trace leading back to Ashford Corp or Reed Ashford, except for the clues only a watchful child like him would have noticed. Phoenix decided to set a test to confirm his theory. If Reed Ashford was truly paying attention to his mother's bakery and listening to everything that happened there, then he would react to information Phoenix deliberately allowed to escape. He knew his mother was struggling with the old mixer she had used since the day the bakery opened. It broke down constantly and had to be repaired again and again. Every time it failed, his mother would sigh and knead dough by hand so the morning orders could still be finished on time, but she didn't have enough money to buy a new one because all her savings had gone toward living expenses and his school tuition. Phoenix wrote a small note in clumsy handwriting, intentionally making it resemble the writing of an ordinary child. The message contained only a few simple lines. That mother's mixer in the bakery breaks every day. It is model K500. It needs to be replaced, but mother doesn't have the money. He folded the note neatly, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and waited for the right moment. That afternoon, while sweeping leaves in front of the bakery, he saw one of the familiar black cars slow down at the end of the street. Phoenix pretended to trip, and the note in his pocket fell neatly onto the sidewalk like a perfect accident. He stood up, brushed off his clothes, and walked straight back into the bakery without picking the note up, leaving it there for anyone who wanted to read it. Exactly 2 days later, a small delivery truck stopped at the bakery's back door, and 2 men carried down an enormous cardboard box. Inside was a brand new industrial mixer, still sealed in its packaging. There was no card with the sender's name, no invoice, no information at all to say where the gift had come from, but Phoenix recognized it at once. It was a model K700, newer and far more expensive than the K500 he had mentioned in the note. Amara, bewildered, called every supplier she knew, but none of them admitted to sending the machine. She even called the insurance company to ask whether it might somehow be part of a compensation package, but the answer was still no. In the end, after days of uncertainty, she decided to keep the mixer and told herself that perhaps it was a gift from some anonymous customer grateful for her pastries. Phoenix stood in the corner of the kitchen watching his mother open the box, her face filled with joy and confusion all at once. He smiled to himself, then returned to his room, opened his notebook, and wrote in clear, decisive lines that test number 1 had been completed and the result was positive, that he was listening to everything happening here, that he didn't boast or demand gratitude, and that he did more than was asked by sending a better model instead of merely the one mentioned. He closed the notebook and looked toward the window, where a black car had just passed and vanished at the far end of the street, while in his mind the largest question of all still turned restlessly, without an answer. Why did Reed Ashford care about this little bakery? And what did he truly want from his mother? On a quiet weekend afternoon, Magnolia Bakery was more deserted than usual, because most of the residents of Harrington had gone out to enjoy the beautiful weather. Amara was busy in the kitchen preparing a large order for a party the next day, the steady hum of the new mixer blending with the fragrance of melting butter and sweet vanilla. Phoenix sat at the small table near the register, his textbooks and homework spread out before him, but from time to time his eyes drifted toward the glass door as though he were waiting for something. The bell attached to the door gave a soft ring to announce a customer, and Phoenix looked up, his heart beating one quick step faster when he recognized the man who had just entered. Reed Ashford stood in the doorway, alone, with no subordinates at his side. No black Maybach convoy parked outside. Only a man in a black shirt, with the collar unbuttoned. No suit jacket, looking far less intimidating than he had the first time they met in the wreckage of the bakery. Phoenix didn't show any surprise, even though inside him 1,000 questions were burning. He had been waiting for this moment ever since the test with the mixer turned out exactly as he had predicted. He knew that sooner or later this man would appear in person instead of merely sending his people. Reed looked around the bakery, his gaze passing over every detail, as though checking whether everything had been repaired according to his standards. And then those eyes came to rest on the boy sitting at the study table. He asked where the boy's mother was, his voice low and even, giving away nothing. Phoenix answered naturally that his mother was working in the kitchen, and then he asked in return whether Reed had come to see his mother or was simply there to buy pastries. Reed gave a brief answer, saying that he wanted to buy pastries, and Phoenix immediately rose and stepped behind the counter like a professional shop assistant, even though he still had to stretch up on his toes to reach the display shelves. He explained that the butter croissants were the bakery's specialty, baked fresh every morning with butter imported from France, and that the waffles, with their crisp outer layer and soft filling, were also very popular with customers, and he asked which one Reed would like to try. Reed looked at the boy for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he stepped closer to the counter and asked how old he was. Phoenix answered that he was 7, then asked in return how old Reed was, with the easy naturalness of someone carrying on an ordinary conversation between people who already knew each other. Reed replied that he was 33. Phoenix immediately did the math in his head and said that meant Reed was 26 years older than he was. He gave a small nod as though storing an important fact in his memory, then asked again which pastry Reed wanted to buy. Reed pointed to the tray of waffles behind the clear glass, and Phoenix carefully used the tongs to place one still warm waffle into a paper bag printed with the Magnolia Bakery logo. Just then there was a sound from the kitchen door. Amara stepped out, one hand still dusted with flour and her apron marked with smudges, and she froze in place the instant she saw who was standing at the counter. She spoke his name with the faintest tremor in her voice. Mr. Ashford, as though that name carried the full weight of a past she had tried to bury. Reed nodded to her with quiet politeness, and said that he had only stopped by to buy pastries, and that her son had already helped him choose. Amara looked at Phoenix, then at Reed. Something flickered through her brown eyes too quickly, too sharply, for Phoenix to read clearly, but he noticed that his mother's hand was gripping the edge of her apron just as tightly as it had the first time she stood before the wreckage of the bakery. She said that her son was very good with customers, her voice trying to remain steady even though a clear tension lay beneath it. Then she turned to Phoenix and told him to go into the kitchen at once. Phoenix didn't disobey his mother, but he didn't leave right away either. He looked at Reed one more time and asked where the scar on his cheek had come from. Amara spoke his name in a sharper tone, filled with reproach, but Reed lifted a hand in a gesture to stop her and said that it was all right, that he didn't mind the question. He touched the faint scar that ran from his temple down to his left cheekbone and said that it came from an accident a very long time ago, when he was young, when life had not yet become as complicated as it was. Phoenix asked whether it had hurt back then. Reed answered that it had hurt then, but that he no longer felt anything now, that some wounds, if a person carries them long enough, become part of the body, and in time one forgets how much they once hurt. Phoenix nodded slowly, as though the answer had touched something deep inside him, then lifted his hand and pointed to the old watch on his wrist. He said that his grandfather had given him that watch before he died, that it had been broken for a very long time and no longer ran, but that he still wore it every day and never took it off. Reed looked at the watch, its hands frozen at 3:47, and asked why he kept something that no longer worked. Phoenix looked straight into Reed's eyes and answered that his grandfather had told him the watch would start again on the day he found the place where he truly belonged, and that he was still waiting for that day to come. A strange silence settled over the little bakery. Reed looked at the boy standing before him, looked at those sharp gray-blue eyes exactly like the eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, exactly like his mother's eyes in old photographs, and something tightened painfully inside his chest, something he couldn't name. Amara stood there witnessing the conversation between the two of them. Her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She could feel that something was happening right in front of her, something she had feared for 7 years, ever since she left Montgomery Mansion in the darkness of night, carrying a secret hidden in her heart. She spoke again, more firmly this time, ordering Phoenix to go into the kitchen right now. And this time Phoenix obeyed. He walked toward the kitchen door, but before disappearing behind it, he turned back and told Reed that he should come there more often, because the pastries in that bakery were best when eaten fresh from the oven, still hot and crisp. Then he disappeared through the doorway, leaving Reed and Amara standing across from each other in the silent bakery, with so many unspoken things hanging in the air between them. No one spoke for a long, breathless stretch of time, and then Reed broke the silence in a low voice. He said that the boy was like her in his calmness, like her in the way he looked straight into another person's eyes without the slightest hesitation. Amara didn't answer. She only stood there looking at him with eyes carrying too many things at once: fear, caution, and something deeper that she didn't dare admit even to herself. Reed placed a bill on the counter, far larger than the price of the waffle, picked up the paper bag, and turned toward the door. Before opening it, he paused for 1 second and said over his shoulder that the waffles there were very good, and that he would come back. The door closed behind him. The bell rang and slowly faded away, and Amara stood alone in the middle of the bakery with trembling hands and a heart beating wildly in her chest. In the kitchen, Phoenix stood behind the door, left open just enough for him to see everything, his eyes following every gesture and every expression on the faces of the two adults, while in his mind the pieces were slowly finding their places, slowly coming together into a picture he had begun sketching. From the day he found the black silk handkerchief with the 2 embroidered letters, R.A., in the corner. 1 week had passed since the afternoon Reed Ashford walked into Magnolia Bakery and had that brief yet deeply significant conversation with Phoenix, a week in which the 7-year-old boy spent most of his time thinking, observing, and threading together every clue he had gathered. He had the black silk handkerchief with the 2 embroidered letters, R.A., in the corner, the one his mother had hidden for years inside his grandmother's keepsake box. He had learned about the shared past between his mother and Reed at Montgomery Mansion, where his grandmother had worked as the cook and Reed's father had served as the butler. He had witnessed Reed's unusual concern, and Ashford Corp's as well, for their tiny bakery, from the repairs and upgrades to the large weekly orders. He had seen the way his mother reacted whenever the past was mentioned, the trembling in her hands, the way her eyes turned away, the hurried answers meant to end the conversation before it could go any farther. And most important of all, he had looked into the mirror every day and seen his own gray-blue eyes exactly like the eyes of the man who had stood in the bakery that afternoon and asked him about the broken watch. Phoenix decided that it was time for him to know the truth, not from clues and deductions anymore, but from his mother's own lips. That evening, after the bakery had closed and the two of them had finished dinner, Phoenix quietly went into his room and took out the black silk handkerchief he had kept from his grandmother's recipe box. He walked into the living room where Amara was standing at the sink, washing dishes, her back turned to him, and he placed the handkerchief in the center of the kitchen table before sitting down in a chair to wait. Amara turned to clear the table, but her eyes stopped at the sight of the black silk handkerchief lying neatly on the wooden surface, and the bowl in her hand nearly slipped from fingers that had suddenly lost all strength. She stood there like a statue, her face draining of color. Phoenix spoke in a voice strangely calm, and said that he had found the handkerchief in his grandmother's recipe box, that he knew what the initials R.A. stood for and who they belonged to, and that he also knew that the man connected to those initials had been taking an interest in their bakery in a way that wasn't ordinary at all. Amara opened her mouth as if to say something, perhaps an explanation or perhaps a denial, but Phoenix didn't give her the chance. He went on, saying that he wasn't angry with her, that he had never been angry with her about anything, that he only wanted to know the truth because he believed he was old enough to understand and strong enough to accept it no matter what that truth might be. He looked straight into his mother's eyes with gray-blue eyes far older than his years and asked whether Reed Ashford was his biological father. That question cut through the taut cord of tension Amara had been trying to hold together for 7 long years. She couldn't answer. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, both hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking in waves of choked sobs. This was the first time Phoenix had ever seen his mother cry like that, not holding back, not trying to hide it, just tears pouring out as though the wall she had built over all those years had finally fallen completely apart. He stood up, walked around the table to her side, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his small hands circling her shoulders. He didn't say anything. He just stood there holding her and waiting until the sobs slowly began to quiet. Much later, when Amara had calmed a little, she began to tell her son the story she had kept hidden for 7 years. She told him about Montgomery Mansion, where his grandmother had worked as a cook and where she herself had grown up from childhood, about the butler's son who was 5 years older than she was, the only person in that great house who had been willing to play with a servant's daughter, and how the two of them had been best friends all through those childhood years. She told him about the night, 8 years ago, when tragedy came down on both of them at once, when her father and Reed's father both died in the same week for different reasons, when the funerals were held on the same day, in a mansion standing on the edge of ruin, and how that night 2 young people drowning in grief and loneliness had turned to each other searching for a little comfort. Through her tears, Amara said that it had happened only once, One single night, one moment of weakness, when they had both needed to be held and to feel that they weren't alone, and that when she woke the next morning she knew she had to leave before everything became more complicated. Phoenix asked why she had to leave, and Amara explained that Reed was crushed by the loss of his father and burdened with facing the collapse of the Montgomery family, while she had also just lost her own father and had nothing at all to her name. She didn't want to become one more burden for anyone, especially not then, when both of them were barely staying afloat inside their own separate pain. He asked when she discovered that she was carrying him, and Amara gave a slow nod and said that 2 months after she had left the mansion and was trying to build a new life in this city, she found out she was pregnant, and by then everything was already too late to go back. She went on to say that when she tried to learn what had become of Reed, she discovered that he had become an entirely different man, cold and ruthless in the world of business, a man people called the Dark King of the city, with power stretching deep into its darkest corners. And she was afraid that if she returned and told him about the child, her little boy's life would be pulled into that dangerous world. Amara looked at her son with red-rimmed eyes and said that she had wanted him to have a real father, a man who would be with him every day and teach him good things, not a frightening shadow the whole city feared, and so she had chosen to keep the secret and raise him alone. Phoenix listened to everything his mother said without interrupting. When she finished, he asked whether Reed knew about his existence. Amara shook her head and whispered that no, he had no idea, that even now he still didn't know he had a son. Phoenix asked whether she intended to tell him the truth, and Amara looked at her son with anguish in her eyes and answered that she didn't know, that she truly didn't know what to do, because she had carried this secret for so long, and she was terrified that telling the truth would change his life forever. Phoenix nodded. He didn't force his mother to make a decision right away. He understood that some things needed time, thought, and careful weighing. But in his own mind, everything was now clear as daylight. Reed Ashford was his biological father. His mother had kept that secret for 7 years because she wanted to protect him, and now he would have to decide for himself what he wanted to do with that truth. He looked down at the watch on his wrist. The hands were still standing motionless at 3:47, just as they did every day. Then he lifted his head, looked at his mother with gentle eyes, and said that no matter what happened, no matter what the truth was, he still loved her, and that would never change. Did she understand that? Amara pulled her son into her arms and held him tightly, as if she feared that if she let go he might disappear. She whispered into his ear that she knew he loved her, and that she loved him more than anything else in this world, that he had been the only reason she had kept going through all the difficult years behind them. 3 days had passed since the night Phoenix confronted his mother with the truth. 3 days in which both mother and son had tried to go on living as though that conversation had never happened. When the accident came crashing down and changed everything, that afternoon had begun as ordinarily as any other. Amara decided to close the bakery 1 hour early so she could deliver a birthday cake order to a regular customer who lived in the building across the street, an older woman who had ordered the cake for her granddaughter's birthday and had paid in advance the day before. Phoenix stayed behind in the shop with Martha, helping her tidy the register counter and stack the chairs in preparation for mopping the floor at the end of the day. Amara held a large cake box, wrapped carefully with a pink ribbon, stepped out of the bakery, and walked toward the curb to cross the street to the other side. She didn't see the white van rushing toward her at a speed far too fast for a crowded neighborhood like this one. The driver was a young man, his eyes fixed on the screen of his phone as he read a message instead of paying attention to the road ahead. Everything happened too fast. The horn blared in wild panic when the driver finally looked up and saw the woman standing in the middle of the street. The shriek of brakes tore through the peaceful afternoon air, sharp and violent, and then came the horrible sound of impact that made everyone on the street turn at once. Phoenix heard all of it from inside the bakery. His heart seemed to stop for a single beat, and then he ran outside as fast as his small legs would allow. What he saw before him was like a nightmare made real. Amara lay motionless on the asphalt, the birthday cake box shattered open, streaks of frosting and pieces of cake scattered all around her. The van had stopped a few yards away, the driver still sitting behind the wheel with every drop of color drained from his face. Passers-by began to gather around them. Some were shouting in panic. Some stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Some lifted their phones to record the scene instead of calling for an ambulance. Phoenix ran to his mother's side and dropped to his knees beside her. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't panic the way most 7-year-old children probably would have in such a moment. His gray-blue eyes moved quickly, taking in the situation, and judging it with astonishing clarity. His mother was still breathing, faintly but steadily. There was no obvious external wound, but she wasn't conscious, and that meant the damage was likely inside. He stood up, drew in a deep breath, and then raised his voice with a steadiness and force that was startling in a child his age. He told someone in the crowd to call an ambulance immediately, if no one had already done it. He asked a woman standing nearby to lend him her coat so it could be placed beneath his mother's head, to keep it from resting directly on the hard pavement. He told a large man to keep the crowd back and give his mother room to breathe. The adults around him stared in disbelief at the calm authority of the little boy, and they obeyed him as though he were the grown one there. Martha came running out of the bakery, her face drained white and her legs trembling. She wrapped her arms around Phoenix and tried to pull him away from the scene, but he gently slipped free from her grasp and told her to stay with him, that she needed to remain calm, because right now his mother needed everyone around her to keep a clear head. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, its sirens screaming through the charged air. The medical team jumped out and quickly assessed Amara's condition. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her into the ambulance. Phoenix refused to leave her side. He told the paramedics that he was the only family member there and that he had to go with her, and the fierce determination in his eyes made it impossible for them to refuse. Throughout the ride to the hospital, he sat inside the ambulance, holding tightly to his mother's hand, never letting go, his eyes fixed on Amara's pale face, while only one thought lived inside him. Mother has to be all right. Nothing can happen to her. At the hospital, Amara was taken straight into the emergency room, and the doors closed in front of Phoenix, leaving him outside with Martha, who had just arrived in a taxi. The attending doctor came out and told Martha in a grave voice that the patient had internal injuries and needed emergency surgery, that the cost would be very high, and that they needed someone to sign the consent forms and guarantee payment. Martha held Phoenix and tried to comfort him, telling him everything would be all right, but Phoenix didn't need empty reassurances. He needed action. He needed a way to save his mother at any cost. In that moment, only one person existed in his mind. One man with enough money and power to solve this situation as quickly as possible. He remembered the license plate numbers of Ashford's convoy, which he had written down carefully in his notebook. He remembered the main switchboard number for Ashford Tower that he had found online while investigating Reed. He even remembered the name of the lieutenant who always stood beside Reed, the man named Cross, who had once come to the bakery to place an order. Phoenix asked Martha if he could step out into the hallway to make a phone call. She nodded without asking questions, assuming that he was contacting someone from his mother's family or circle of friends. He walked into the empty hallway, took out the old phone his mother had given him for emergencies, and dialed the Ashford Tower switchboard number he had long since memorized. A professional female voice came on after a few rings, greeting him and asking how she could help. Phoenix took a deep breath and said in a calm, clear voice that he needed to speak directly to Mr. Reed Ashford right away, that this was an emergency involving Amara Price. A long silence followed on the other end of the line, and then the woman asked who was calling. Phoenix answered without the slightest tremor in his voice that he was Phoenix Price, the son of Amara Price. And then he paused for 1 second, as though weighing the next words before he spoke them, and added that he might also be the son of Mr. Reed Ashford. At the exact moment Phoenix spoke those words into the phone, Reed Ashford was sitting in the conference room on the top floor of Ashford Tower, facing a delegation of business partners from Europe. A deal worth tens of millions of dollars was being negotiated, and every eye in the room was fixed on him, waiting for his final decision. Cross was standing in the corner as always, silently observing and ready to assist his employer whenever needed, when his phone suddenly vibrated, and he stepped outside to answer it. Cross's face changed the moment he heard what the person on the other end was saying. He returned to the conference room with a look of tension rarely seen on him, bent down to Reed's ear, and whispered a few short words. Reed stood up at once without offering a single explanation to the partners sitting there in astonishment, and he walked out of the meeting, leaving tens of millions of dollars on the negotiating table, along with the stunned eyes of everyone in the room. Cross had worked beside Reed for 10 years, and never once had he seen his boss act like that. Never once had Reed abandoned an important negotiation for any reason. Never once had he seen those eyes flash with something Cross could only describe as panic, hidden with extraordinary care. 20 minutes after Cross's phone had rung, the black Maybach came to a stop at the hospital entrance, and Reed Ashford stepped out with a stride faster than usual. He entered the emergency wing wearing his familiar, expressionless face, but anyone who knew him would have recognized the tension hidden in every movement. in the way his jaw was set tight, in the way his eyes kept sweeping through the hall, in search of a familiar face. Phoenix was sitting on a cold plastic chair outside the operating room, his small frame almost swallowed by the vast hospital corridor with its pale white lights and its heavy smell of antiseptic. Martha sat beside him, her hand tightly gripping the boy's as though she feared that if she let go he would collapse, though in truth she was the one who needed reassurance most at that moment. When Phoenix lifted his head and saw Reed approaching, he rose to his feet without the slightest sign of surprise, as though he had known with certainty that this man would come, as though he had trusted completely that Reed would never ignore his call. He said only one simple thing. "You came," his voice strangely calm, for a child who had just watched his mother be struck down in an accident. Reed asked what had happened, and Phoenix told him in brief and precise words. A traffic accident. A van hit his mother while she was crossing the street. She needed emergency surgery because of internal injuries, and the cost was far beyond what he and his mother could afford. Reed asked nothing more. He took out his phone and began making one call after another, his voice cold and commanding as he gave orders to the people on the other end. Within 10 minutes, everything had been arranged. The best surgeon in the hospital had been summoned, even though he was off duty that night. The best room, fully equipped with the most advanced machines for her recovery after surgery, had already been secured. A large sum of money had been transferred to the hospital account, making it clear that cost would no longer be an obstacle to any treatment that might be necessary. Reed closed his phone and sat down in the empty chair beside Phoenix. Martha looked at him with bewilderment and wonder, unable to understand who this powerful man was or why he had appeared to help them like this. Reed turned to her and said in a voice that was courteous, yet impossible to refuse, that he appreciated her staying beside the boy during this difficult moment, that he would take care of everything from here, and that she could go home and rest because the night ahead would certainly be long. Martha looked at Phoenix as though asking for his permission. Phoenix gave a small nod and told her that it was all right, that this man was an old acquaintance of his mother, and that she could go home without worrying. Martha left after telling Phoenix to call her if he needed anything at all. She squeezed the boy's hand one final time before disappearing down the endless hallway. The two of them sat in silence, watching the light above the operating room continue to burn, a sign that the surgery was still underway. A 7-year-old child wearing a broken watch on his wrist and a powerful tycoon in an expensive suit, sitting side by side on a row of plastic chairs in the cold hospital corridor deep in the night. After a long stretch of silence, Reed finally asked why Phoenix had called him out of everyone he could have asked for help. Phoenix didn't turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on the door of the operating room as he answered that Reed was the only person capable of helping his mother in a situation like this. Reed said there were other options: the hospital's support programs, the insurance company, or charitable organizations. Phoenix turned to look straight into Reed's eyes and said, "But none of those could bring the best surgeon here within 10 minutes. None of those could make every financial obstacle disappear after only a few phone calls. And most importantly, no one else in this world would walk out of a meeting negotiating millions of dollars just to rush to a hospital because of a call from a child they had no obligation to care about." Reed fell silent, because this boy had seen through him more clearly than he had expected. Phoenix continued in the same calm voice, saying that he knew Reed cared about his mother. He didn't know exactly why, but he knew that much was true, and in this moment, that was all he needed to know. They sat there through the night, with little more said between them, while the distant hum of machines rose and fell in the hallway, and the footsteps of nurses sometimes passed by, two strangers, and yet perhaps not entirely strangers, waiting together for news of the woman they both cared about. The light above the operating room went out at 3 o'clock in the morning. The door opened, and the surgeon stepped out, still wearing his surgical clothes, and announced that the operation had been successful, that the patient would need time to recover, but her condition was stable, and she was going to survive. Phoenix let out a breath of relief. His shoulders dropped, and his body seemed to go limp after hours of tension. For the first time throughout that long night, he looked like an ordinary 7-year-old child, instead of a tiny adult forcing himself to stand firm in the face of hardship. Reed looked at the boy sitting beside him and felt something stir inside his chest, something he had thought had died long ago on the night his father passed away, something he had tried to bury deep beneath the cold shell of the Dark King. Amara survived the surgery and was moved into the best private room in the hospital, a spacious room with large windows overlooking the flower garden inside the grounds, with a private nurse on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. and every piece of the most advanced medical equipment that money could buy. Reed arranged all of it without asking for anyone's opinion. He gave the order and everyone obeyed, just as they had been trained to do through long years inside his empire. Phoenix firmly refused to leave the hospital even though Martha urged him many times to go home and rest. He said that he wanted to stay close to his mother, and that he wouldn't go anywhere until she opened her eyes and looked at him. Martha had no choice but to take turns coming to the hospital with food and clean clothes for him. She worried about a 7-year-old child being forced to face far too much in such a short span of time. Yet she couldn't help admiring the strength and maturity in him that reached far beyond his years. While Phoenix sat beside his mother's bed waiting for her to wake, Reed summoned Cross to a small room at the end of the hallway, a room he had turned into a temporary office so he could continue handling business, while also keeping watch over the situation at the hospital. He sat behind the small desk, his distant gaze fixed on the glass window overlooking the hospital grounds below. And then he spoke in an even, low voice, saying that he needed Cross to verify a timeline. 8 years ago, the night his father died was also the night Amara's father died, and that boy was now 7 years old. Cross understood at once what his employer wanted confirmed. He asked whether Reed wanted him to verify the blood connection. Reed nodded and said that he needed Cross to find a way to collect the boy's DNA sample discreetly, without anyone knowing, not even the boy or his mother. Cross replied that he could gather a sample from objects the child had used and left behind. A glass of water, a straw, or anything carrying the boy's cells. And Reed gave a silent nod for him to proceed. Cross left to carry out the task. Reed rose and walked to the window, staring out at the city's night sky, with its thousands of lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. He had suspected the truth from the very first moment he looked into the boy's eyes amid the wreckage of Magnolia Bakery. Those sharp, gray-blue eyes were exactly like his mother's eyes in the old photographs he still kept. Exactly like the eyes he saw in the mirror every morning while shaving. But suspicion was something vague, while certainty was a truth that couldn't be denied. And Reed needed the truth before he could decide what his next step would be. 3 days after Cross received the assignment, he returned to Reed's temporary office with a small white envelope in his hand and an expression dark and unreadable. He set the envelope on the desk in front of Reed and said simply that the test results showed a match of 99.99%, enough to conclude a direct biological relationship between father and son. Reed didn't pick up the envelope and didn't open it. He didn't need to see the numbers written on the paper, because he had known the answer from the moment that boy looked straight into his eyes without the slightest trace of fear. 7 years. He had had a son for 7 years, and had never known the child existed. For 7 years, that boy had grown up without a father while Reed was building his empire and turning himself into the Dark King of this city. Cross asked what he intended to do now with that information. Reed rose and walked to the window, looking out over the city below, still lit and alive and moving as though nothing had changed, while the world outside had no idea that the world inside him had just been overturned completely by a single sheet of paper resting in that white envelope. He spoke in a contemplative voice, saying that for 10 years he had built an empire with his bare hands. He had crushed the enemies who tried to block his path. He had made decisions that altered the fate of thousands without hesitation or second thought. And yet now, standing before a 7-year-old child, he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to become a father when he had never had any model to learn from after his own father died. Cross was silent for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried the rare sincerity of a friend, more than a loyal subordinate. He said that perhaps that was exactly the point. Perhaps this time it wasn't about what Reed already knew, or what he had managed to do in the past, but about what he was willing to learn and change in the future. Reed didn't respond to that observation. He remained standing there, looking out through the glass with an expression impossible to read. Cross continued, saying that the boy was very intelligent, more intelligent than most adults he had ever met, that he had been quietly observing and investigating Reed for weeks without anyone noticing, that he kept a notebook recording every piece of information he collected, and that he was building a complete file on Reed Ashford. Reed turned back with a look of surprise so rare it was almost startling, and asked whether the boy had investigated him. Cross nodded and said yes. That boy had been researching him on his own through the internet, and through careful observation of the people Reed had sent to the bakery. He had even laid traps to test whether Reed was truly listening to what happened there. As Cross had said, this was a child more intelligent than most grown men. Reed looked down at the white envelope, still lying motionless on the desk, then let out a small, quiet laugh so faint that Cross might have missed it if the room hadn't been so completely silent. He said, with something in his voice that sounded almost like pride, something Cross had never heard there before, that in that case the boy was truly his son. Without question, that child was his blood. The next morning, after Reed received the DNA test results, confirming that Phoenix was his biological son, he sat alone in the hospital cafeteria at the farthest corner of the room, where the fewest people passed by. In front of him sat a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago, untouched, while his eyes stared into the empty space before him as though he had wandered into another world, one where he was trying to put everything in his mind back into order. He didn't realize that Phoenix had entered the cafeteria and was walking straight toward him until the boy pulled out a chair and sat down across from him without asking permission, as though it were his natural right to do so. Phoenix looked straight into Reed's eyes and said in a calm but resolute voice that they needed to talk, truly talk for once. Not circle around each other with half conversations and avoided looks anymore, that it was time for both of them to face the truth. Reed looked at the boy sitting before him and didn't seem surprised, perhaps because he had been waiting for this moment ever since he realized the boy's eyes were exactly like his own. Phoenix placed his worn leather notebook on the table and opened it to the page titled Evidence, written in his neat, careful hand. Inside was everything he had gathered over the past weeks. The image of the black silk handkerchief with the letters R.A. embroidered in one corner, the timeline he had calculated from the day Reed's father and his mother's father died to the day he himself was born, the tests he had set, and the results proving that Reed had been listening to everything happening at the bakery, the notes on everything Ashford Corp had done for Magnolia Bakery since the day of the accident. He said that he had known for weeks, perhaps even longer if he counted the vague suspicions that had lived inside him before that, and that all he had needed was one final confirmation to be certain that what he had reasoned out was true. Reed looked at the notebook and then back at the boy in front of him with a complicated expression that was hard to read, and he asked what it was that Phoenix wanted now. Phoenix answered that he wanted to hear the truth from Reed's own mouth, not from the pages of that notebook, not from his own guesses and deductions, but from him, that Reed was his biological father, wasn't he? Reed was silent for such a long moment that even the noise of the hospital cafeteria, with patients and nurses moving back and forth, seemed to quiet around them, and then he spoke, his voice lower than usual, as though he were saying something deeply private. He said that he had received the DNA test results yesterday, that the match was 99.99%, enough to confirm the biological relationship between them. Phoenix nodded slowly, as though he had already known the answer but still needed to hear it spoken aloud by the man sitting across from him, and he said that meant the truth had now been confirmed. Reed answered yes, that was the truth. They sat there facing one another across the cheap plastic table in the hospital cafeteria. A powerful kingpin feared across the city, and a 7-year-old boy with a broken watch on his wrist. Father and son, seeing each other for the first time as father and son. After 7 years of separation, neither of them had known existed. Around them, life went on as usual. Nurses still carried meal trays back and forth. Patients still sat at other tables talking quietly, but between the two of them, time seemed to stop. Phoenix asked why, for 7 years, Reed had never searched for them, why he had never tried to find out where his mother was, or what had happened after that night. Reed didn't try to defend himself or offer excuses. He admitted honestly that on that night he had been drowning in grief over his father's death, that he had drunk too much, and that when he woke the next morning, Phoenix's mother had already left without leaving a word behind. He had believed that she regretted what had happened and didn't want to see him again. He had never known that she had carried a part of him with her. Phoenix asked if everything would have been different if Reed had known from the beginning, whether he would have searched for them and entered his life sooner. Reed didn't answer that question right away. He looked down at the cold coffee in front of him, as though weighing the most truthful answer he could possibly give, because it was the very question he had been asking himself over the past days, since he first began to suspect the truth of their relationship. At last, he said, with a painful honesty, that he didn't know. The man he had been 8 years ago had just lost his father, and had been trying to rebuild everything from ashes. He didn't know what that man would have done if he had known he had a child. But the man he was now knew one thing for certain. He was here, and he had no intention of going anywhere. Phoenix watched him for a long time, with eyes far older than his years, weighing and measuring every word he said, exactly the way Reed sized up opponents in important negotiations. exactly the way a careful person tests whether someone can be trusted or not. Then he said, "All right." Reed asked what all right meant. Phoenix answered that all right meant he accepted that answer, but with one condition. Reed asked what the condition was. Phoenix pointed toward the hallway outside, leading to the wing where Amara was lying, and said that Reed had to go see his mother, had to tell her that he knew the truth, and had to let her decide for herself what would happen next in the relationship between the three of them. Reed nodded in agreement. Phoenix added that there was one more thing. Reed remarked that he seemed to have quite a lot of conditions. Phoenix didn't smile. He looked straight into Reed's eyes and said that this condition was the most important one. Reed wasn't allowed to disappear. That was the only rule Phoenix was setting. Reed could be busy with work. He could be frightening in the eyes of other people. He could be anything he needed to be to maintain his empire. But he wasn't allowed to disappear from Phoenix's life after having entered it. Reed looked at his 7-year-old son sitting across from him with a calmness and maturity far beyond his age. The child laying down conditions for the most powerful kingpin in the city, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and he felt his heart soften in a way that was strangely unfamiliar. He said that he promised. Phoenix nodded, and this time something softer appeared in his gray-blue eyes. He said, "Good. Now you should go talk to my mother, because she'll be waking up soon." Amara fully woke after 1 week in the hospital. She opened her eyes slowly, and the first thing she saw in the gentle light of the room was Phoenix sitting in the chair beside her bed, a book resting in his hands, though his eyes were fixed on her with such careful attention that it seemed he had been sitting there guarding her through the entire week. The second thing she noticed, once her eyes adjusted to the light, was a bouquet of white daisies arranged in a glass vase on the bedside table. Pure white blossoms with soft petals giving off a light, familiar fragrance that made her heart tighten at once. White daisies had been her favorite flowers since childhood, back when she lived at Montgomery Mansion. She used to pick them in the back garden and place them in her grandmother's room, and there had been only one person in the world besides her late grandmother who knew that. That afternoon, when Phoenix went out to lunch with Martha in the hospital cafeteria so Amara could rest, the door to her room opened and Reed Ashford stepped inside. He closed the door behind him and stood there at a careful distance from the bed. And they faced each other for the first time after 8 years apart, in a private space, with no one else there to witness it. Amara didn't ask why he had come, or how he had gotten in. She only said in a calm voice that he knew now, didn't he? And it wasn't really a question, but the confirmation of something she had already expected. Reed nodded and answered that he knew, that he had known for several days now, ever since the test results had come back. Amara said that Phoenix had told her he had sent someone to collect a DNA sample, and Reed confirmed that it was true. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the steady sound of the heart monitor, as if it were reminding them that life was still moving forward beyond this tense conversation. Amara spoke again, her voice trembling slightly, and said that she had carried this secret for 8 years, 8 long years in which she had raised their son alone and kept the truth about his father hidden. Reed asked why she hadn't tried to contact him when she discovered she was pregnant, why she had chosen to disappear and guard this secret for so many years. Amara looked at him with eyes filled with too many emotions woven together. The exhaustion of a woman who had fought alone for far too long, the quiet fear she had buried deep through all those years, but also a strange sense of relief now that the secret had finally come into the light. She answered that it was because she had seen what he became after that night. She had watched from a distance and seen him build his empire with coldness and ruthlessness. She had heard the stories people told about the dark king of the city, and she had been afraid that her son would be pulled into that world. She had wanted Phoenix to have a real father, not a terrifying shadow hanging over his life. Reed didn't try to defend himself or argue against her words, because he knew she was right. He knew exactly what kind of man he had become over the past 8 years, and he had no right to blame her for wanting to protect their son from that man. He said that he understood her reasons, and that he wasn't angry. But there was one thing he needed her to know. Amara asked what it was. Reed stepped closer and sat down in the chair where Phoenix had spent the past week, and he said that he couldn't change the past, couldn't take back the 7 years he had been absent from his son's life, but he could be here from now on if she would allow him to do that. Amara looked at him with searching eyes and asked what about his world? What about the danger and hostility that always came with the name Reed Ashford? Because she didn't want her son living in fear simply because he carried Reed's blood. Reed admitted that he didn't have a perfect answer to that question. He only knew one thing for certain, that he would protect his son at any cost, no matter what happened. and he paused briefly as though trying to find the right words before continuing that perhaps he would protect her too, if she would let him. Amara said nothing. Tears slipped silently down her pale cheeks, made fragile by the long days in the hospital. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall freely, as though they were releasing everything she had kept locked inside for 8 years. At last she spoke, and said that she wasn't someone who forgave easily, and she wasn't someone who forgot the past easily either, but then she drew in a deep breath, before continuing that perhaps they could begin again from here. From this moment, not by going back to the past, but by building a new future. Reed nodded, and said that was all he could dare hope for. Just then the door to the room opened slightly, and Phoenix appeared in the doorway, carrying a box of pastries from the hospital cafeteria, his eyes moving over the two adults with the look of someone who had already known exactly how this would go. He walked into the room as though nothing unusual were happening, and said that his mother needed to eat something to regain her strength. Then he turned to Reed, and added that Reed did too, because he knew Reed hadn't eaten anything all day. Reed and Amara looked at each other, and then both of them laughed. Small, tired laughs, but honest ones. The first real laughter they had shared in a very long time. Reed said that the boy was like his mother. Amara answered no. The boy was more like him, stubborn, determined, and never willing to give up until he got what he wanted. Phoenix placed the box of pastries on the small table beside the hospital bed and looked at the two adults with a serious expression. He asked whether they had come to an agreement now, all of them, with no more anger and no more secrets left between them. Amara looked at her son and said yes. Reed nodded and said yes as well. Phoenix gave a satisfied nod at their answer and said, "Good." Now both of the adults needed to eat, and after that they would talk about what was going to happen next. 2 weeks after the day, Amara woke in her hospital room to find a bouquet of white daisies, and to have that first conversation with Reed after 8 years apart. The doctors finally allowed her to be discharged once her health had fully recovered. Reed arranged for the two of them to stay temporarily in a new apartment, one that was more spacious and far safer, located in a building with strict security and close to the hospital so her follow-up visits would be easier, while Magnolia Bakery was given additional upgrades as well, with a full security camera system and modern locks installed to make sure mother and son would be safe when they returned to work. On the first Sunday after Amara had fully recovered and was able to walk normally again without assistance, the three of them sat down together in the living room of the new apartment to talk about the future. It was the first time they had ever sat together like a family, though none of them had yet dared to call their relationship by that name. The room was quiet, and the afternoon sunlight fell through the windows in warm golden bands across the wooden floor. Phoenix sat in a large armchair with his feet unable to reach the floor, his familiar worn leather notebook resting across his lap, and the broken watch still lying silent on his wrist. Amara and Reed sat on the sofa opposite him, with just enough distance between them. Not so close that it felt awkward, but not so far apart that it suggested distance either, as though the two of them were carefully feeling their way forward one step at a time in this new relationship. Phoenix was the first to break the silence when he asked what they were going to do next, his voice as calm as though this were nothing more than an ordinary family meeting to discuss weekend plans. Amara and Reed looked at each other, but neither wanted to speak first. They both seemed to be waiting for the other to offer an idea, or perhaps neither of them really knew where to begin with a situation this complicated. Phoenix let out a sigh, a strangely world-weary sigh for a 7-year-old child, then said that he would make it simple. He already knew everything. His mother had told him about the past and about her relationship with Reed. Mr. Reed had confirmed the DNA test results proving that he was Phoenix's biological father, and Phoenix himself had already been investigating everything for weeks before that. He lifted the notebook slightly and added that he had a complete file on everything inside it. Amara looked at her son with an expression caught somewhere between laughter and tears, and asked whether he truly had a file. Phoenix gave a serious nod and explained that yes, he had a file on Mr. Reed, on his mother, on the relationship between them, and on everything that had happened. He was the kind of person who liked to prepare carefully before making any important decision. Reed couldn't stop a small laugh from escaping him and remarked that the boy was thorough. Phoenix gave a grave little nod, accepting the compliment as though it were simply an obvious fact that required no false modesty. Then he lowered the notebook back onto his lap, and his voice softened when he began to say what was really in his heart. He said that he had spent all 7 years of his life wondering who his father was, imagining a man he had never met, building in his mind the image of a perfect father. And now that man was here in front of him, real, flesh and blood. not just a blurred figure living in his imagination. He admitted that perhaps Reed wasn't perfect the way he had once imagined. Perhaps he had done things in the past that weren't good, and perhaps he was the kind of man this whole city feared. But he was also the man who had left a meeting worth millions of dollars and rushed to the hospital the moment he heard Amara had been in an accident. He was the man who had sat through the night on a cold bench outside the operating room waiting for news. He was the man who had listened to everything Phoenix said and taken him seriously without ever laughing at him or dismissing him simply because he was a child. Phoenix looked straight into Reed's eyes and said that he wasn't the father Phoenix had imagined for 7 years, but he was the father Phoenix truly had, and Phoenix had decided that was enough for him. Amara cried then, quiet tears slipping down her cheeks without a sound. And she simply sat there looking at her son, with all the love and pride a mother could hold for her child. Reed couldn't speak either. He only looked at the 7-year-old boy sitting before him, with a calmness and maturity far beyond his age, saying words that accepted him without demanding that he become someone else, and he felt something inside his chest break open and heal again in a completely new way, as though his heart were being remade after years of being frozen solid. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but couldn't find the right words. Phoenix stopped him and said that he didn't need to say anything at all. He only needed to be here. That was all Phoenix needed from him. That was all he had ever wished for through 7 long years. A father who was present in his life instead of an empty space he had to fill with imagination. The room fell into silence for a long time, with only the sound of 3 quiet breaths and the wall clock marking each passing second. And then Phoenix suddenly stood up from the armchair and walked over to where Reed was sitting. He stopped in front of him and looked up at the face of the man he could now call his father. Reed looked down at the boy, not knowing what he was about to do. And then Phoenix opened his arms wide in a gesture any child in the world would understand. It was an invitation to be held. Reed sat there for a stunned moment, looking at the 7-year-old child standing before him with his arms spread wide, and then he understood what the boy wanted. Slowly, he lowered himself until he was level with his son, opened his arms, and Phoenix rushed into his embrace with all the strength his small body could hold, clinging to him as though he feared that if he let go, his father would vanish like a dream. In that warm embrace, Phoenix whispered against Reed's shoulder that he mustn't disappear, that this was the only rule he had set, that Reed could be busy with work, he could be frightening in other people's eyes, he could be anything he needed to be, but he mustn't disappear from Phoenix's life. Reed held his son tightly, his eyes closed, and promised that he wouldn't disappear. Phoenix asked again if he truly promised, and Reed answered that he truly did. Then Phoenix stepped back from his father's arms and lifted the broken watch in his hand, studying it for a long moment. He said that his grandfather had told him this watch would start running again when he found the place where he belonged, and that it had been stopped for 3 years ever since the day his grandfather died. He handed the watch to Reed and told him to hold it. Reed took the tiny watch into his large hand. It was old, with a scratched crystal, and hands frozen at 3:47, an object with no material value at all, and yet the boy had treasured it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Phoenix told him to give it back. Reed returned the watch, and Phoenix looked at it once more. The hands still stood motionless, at 3:47, without the slightest movement, but Phoenix only smiled. The first truly radiant smile Reed had seen on the boy's face since the day they met. He said that it was all right, that perhaps his grandfather hadn't been entirely wrong, that perhaps the watch didn't need to start running again to prove anything, that perhaps he had already found the place where he belonged, and the watch simply needed a little more time to catch up. Reed felt something tighten in his throat. He was the man no one in the city dared to look in the eye, the dark king built upon coldness and ruthlessness, and yet at this moment, he was struggling not to cry in front of a 7-year-old child. Amara sat on the sofa watching the scene before her, one hand covering her mouth while tears kept falling without end. This was the thing she had feared most, and yet also the thing she had wished for most through 7 long years, to see her son in the arms of his biological father, and now that it was happening before her eyes, she no longer knew what she was supposed to feel. Then Phoenix turned to look at his mother, one hand still tightly holding Reed's, and called for her, telling her to come over to him. Amara hesitated for a brief moment. Phoenix called again, his voice gentle but firm, asking her please. She rose and walked toward them, slowly and uncertainly, as though she were stepping onto a path whose destination she couldn't yet see. Phoenix took his mother's hand and placed it into Reed's free hand, and the 3 of them stood there hand in hand. forming a small circle in the middle of the living room while the soft afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. Phoenix said with satisfaction that it was done now, and that they could begin. Amara asked, "Begin what?" Her voice still trembling with emotion. Phoenix gave the brightest smile he had ever worn, and answered that they could begin being a family, of course. Reed looked at Amara, and Amara looked at Reed, and then both of them looked down at their 7-year-old son standing between them with the broken watch in his hand, the notebook of observations tucked into his pocket, and a calm maturity that even grown people would have had to admire. Phoenix looked at Reed and said that he would give him time to learn how to love his mother, but that he shouldn't take too long because Phoenix would be tracking the progress in his notebook. Reed laughed, and Amara laughed too. Both laughs were a little choked and a little trembling, but they were the first real laughs either of them had had in a very long time. Phoenix looked down at the watch one last time. The hand still stood at 3:47 without moving, but this time he was no longer waiting for it to run again, because now he understood what his grandfather had meant. His grandfather hadn't been wrong. The watch had stopped to mark an important moment, the moment when he lost someone he loved. And now it still remained there as a reminder that time doesn't always need to move forward in order to mean something, because sometimes the truest meaning lies in the people standing beside you in the present. Phoenix looked at his mother and father, their hands still tightly linked, their eyes still wet with tears, and yet both of them were smiling with happiness. He said that he was hungry now and wanted waffles, because he thought this was a special enough occasion to deserve a celebration. Amara laughed more freely then, her laughter warm and ringing through the room, and answered that all right, waffles for everyone. Phoenix nodded in satisfaction, then turned to Reed and asked if he liked waffles. Reed looked at his son, the child who had entered his life like a small storm and overturned everything he had once believed about himself. And he said that he did, that he liked waffles very much. And in that small room on a peaceful Sunday afternoon, a family had been found. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Like the watch stopped at 3:47, they didn't need time to prove anything. They only needed each other. And for Phoenix, that was everything he had been searching for through all 7 years of his life. And that is the whole story for today. A story about the courage of a 7-year-old boy, about the quiet love of a single mother, and about the awakening of a powerful man when he realized that he had a family waiting for him. Tell us how this story made you feel, and share your thoughts in the comment section below, because we'd truly love to hear whatever is resting deep in your hearts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to press the like button and share it with your friends and loved ones so they can watch it too. And most of all, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the moving stories we share every day. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.